They told me the posting was administrative, a 6-month cataloging assignment on behalf of the Accord's Bureau of Hereditary Records, cycle, documentation, medical log transcription, quarterly status filing, the kind of work that disappears into cabinets and never gets read. I was told the estate was remote, the climate was cold, and the stipend was generous for the inconvenience. They did not tell me about her. The shuttle put me down on a gravel landing circle at the base of Sarin Peak just after midday. The air was thin and tasted of iron and wet stone. The Velkos Highland Estate sat above me on a series of natural terraces cut into the mountainside. Grey-green stone walls, narrow windows, a courtyard paved in dark slate that caught the afternoon light and held it. It was not a palace. It was the kind of place a family builds when they expect to be forgotten. A steward named Olin met me at the gate. He was Velkos house staff, tall, thin-framed, with the pale lavender skin and elongated features common to the northern Velkos lineage. He carried my transit case without being asked, which I took as politeness until I realized it was efficiency. He wanted me inside and briefed before the next dormancy window. The princess entered a cycle 14 hours ago, Olin said as we climbed the interior stairwell. Duration is unpredictable. Could be 6 hours, could be 6 days. Your quarters are on the east corridor, third door. The archive room is across the hall. Do not enter her chamber during dormancy unless the medical monitor alerts. Do not touch her. Do not move her. Do not speak to her. She cannot hear you. Understood. One more thing. He stopped on the landing and looked at me with an expression I would later learn was not hostility but exhaustion. The last records keeper lasted 11 days. The one before that, 9. The Accord has sent 7 since the registry assessment began. You are the 8th. I set my bag on the floor of my quarters and looked out the window. The valley below Sarin Peak was a long grey-green corridor of alpine scrub, and beyond it the distant haze of the lowland basins where the Velkos seat of government had once been before the house's political collapse. This estate was not a prison, but it had the architecture of a place where people are sent when the alternative is admitting they exist. I opened the archive room that evening and began. The files were a mess, 7 predecessors, and not one of them had maintained a coherent index. Dormancy logs were mixed with dietary records. Medical sensor readouts were filed by date in one drawer and by cycle number in another. Correspondence from the Accord's Bureau, polite, bureaucratic, relentless, was stacked in a crate on the floor, most of it unanswered. I spent the first 3 days just sorting. It was during that sorting that I began to understand what the file said about Princess Neath Velkos. She had been born with Vel-Sarin dormancy syndrome. It was rare. 1 in several hundred thousand among the northern Velkos population, vanishingly rare among the broader Accord species. Her autonomic nervous system would, without warning, initiate a full shutdown. Breathing slowed to near perceptibility. Core temperature dropped. Brainwave activity fell to a pattern the medical texts compared to deep hibernation. It could last hours. It could last days. The longest episode on record, hers, documented when she was 19, had been 11 days. She could not predict when it would happen. She could not prevent it. She could not be woken from it. She simply fell asleep, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes mid-step, and the world continued without her until her body decided she was allowed to return. The Accord's marriage registry had listed her as eligible at the customary age. 22 suitors had been presented over the following 4 years. The correspondence made the pattern clear. Each suitor arrived, was briefed on the condition, observed 1 dormancy episode, and departed. Some left formal refusal notices. Most simply didn't come back. One had written a letter to the bureau that I found in the crate. The relevant line read, "I cannot commit my house to a consort who may not be present for the birth of an heir, the signing of a treaty, or the speaking of her own vows." The bureau's internal notes, which I was not supposed to have access to, but which had been misfiled with the dietary records, used the phrase "functionally unsuitable" 4 times in 6 pages. I filed everything. I built a clean index. I cross-referenced the dormancy logs with the medical sensor data and produced a chart that showed her cycle patterns over the previous 3 years. The pattern was not random. It was not predictable either, but it was not random. There were clusters, periods of frequent short cycles followed by long stable stretches. The longest stable stretch in the data was 41 days. The medical notes never mentioned this. No one had looked. On the 4th morning, I came into the archive room and found a cup of Velsoth tea on my desk. It was warm. A small folded cloth had been placed under it to protect the wood. Olin told me the princess had woken during the night, a 9-hour cycle. She had been awake for approximately 4 hours, had eaten, had walked the courtyard, and had noticed the light in the archive room. She had not come in. I set the tea aside and looked at the folded cloth. It was a small square of woven fabric, the kind used to wrap instruments or line storage drawers. Someone had taken the time to fold it into a neat pad and place it precisely under the cup, so the heat would not mark the archive desk. A person in the middle of a waking window of unknown duration had walked past my door in the dark, seen the light I leave on in the archive room, gone to the kitchen, heated water, steeped the Velsoth leaves, folded the cloth, placed the cup, and left without waking me. That was the first time I understood something about Neath Velkos that was not in the file. I found her that afternoon in the south courtyard, sitting on the low stone wall that overlooked the valley. She was smaller than I expected. The portraits in the archive, formal, stiff, painted during her registry-eligible years, had made her look austere. In person she was slight, fine-boned, with dark auburn hair pulled back from her face and skin the color of pale lavender in the late-day mountain light. Her eyes were warm gray, large, and when she looked at me, there was something in them I recognized from the files. The particular stillness of someone who has learned not to start things she may not be allowed to finish. "You're the new one," she said. "Torringale, Bureau of Hereditary Records. How long do you plan to stay?" I understood the question. It was not about my contract. 6 months, I said. "That's the assignment." She looked at me the way you look at weather, something that arrives and passes and is not worth adjusting to. Then she nodded and turned back to the valley. "The tea was good," I said. "Thank you." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not quite. A small crack in the stillness, as if she had expected me to say something else, and my not saying it had cost her a piece of the wall she kept in place. "You're welcome," she said. Over the next several weeks, I learned the rhythm of the estate. Neath's waking periods averaged between 2 and 5 days. Her dormancy episodes ranged from 8 hours to, once, while I was there, 4 days. When she was awake, she was quiet, precise, and deliberate. She moved through the estate with the efficiency of someone who understood that time was not guaranteed. She read, standing up. She ate quickly. She kept a small journal that she wrote in each morning and each evening, as if bookending the hours she had been given, marking them as hers before they could be taken. When she was asleep, the estate went silent. The staff moved through their duties in low voices. The medical monitor in her chamber hummed. I sat in the archive room and worked. I did not leave during the silent hours. I did not pace. I did not count. I simply stayed, and the work continued and when she woke I was there, and the archive was a little more complete than it had been before. It took her 3 weeks to come into the archive room. She stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves I had reorganized, the index cards I had written, the chart I had pinned to the wall showing her dormancy clusters. "You built a chart," she said. "The data was there, no one had graphed it." She stepped closer and studied it. I watched her trace the cluster patterns with her eyes, the same patterns I had found, the long stable stretches that no one had documented. 41 days, she said quietly, your longest stable period, 3 times in the last 2 years. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "No one ever looked at it that way." "What way?" "As though the waking hours were the pattern. Everyone else counts the dormancy, how long she sleeps, how often, how inconvenient." She touched the edge of the chart with one finger. "You counted how long I was here." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She stood there for another moment, then left. But the next morning, there was a second cup of Velsoth tea on my desk, and beside it, a small vase of alpine sorrel she had picked from the courtyard wall. After that, we talked, not about the dormancy, not about the registry, about the valley, the weather patterns on Sarin Peak, the way the light changed in the south courtyard at different times of day. She told me about the Velkos House Library that had been in the lowland seat before the political collapse, 300 years of accumulated texts, most of them lost. I told her about the Records Bureau, about the filing systems I had built for other postings, about the particular satisfaction of finding order in a disordered archive. She asked me once why I had taken the assignment. "The stipend was generous," I said. She looked at me with those warm grey eyes. "That's what the last 7 said. The difference is, I'm still here." That cracked something open. Not laughter. She was not someone who laughed easily, but a softening around her eyes, a release of tension in her shoulders, as if she had been holding something rigid, and my sentence had given her permission to set it down for a moment. "Yes," she said, "you are." The first envoy arrived at the end of my 2nd month. He was a bureau assessor named Dren Velorath, compact and efficient, with the clipped manner of someone who had been sent to confirm a conclusion that had already been reached. He carried a formal review packet and a portable biometric scanner. He was there to update Neath's registry status, a required annual assessment. I sat in the archive room while he conducted his evaluation. I could hear his voice through the wall, measured, professional, thorough. He asked her to describe her most recent cycle durations. He asked about her dietary compliance. He asked whether she had experienced any episodes of disorientation upon waking, a clinical phrase that I had come to understand meant they wanted to know if she was confused when she came back to herself, if the dormancy left her diminished. She answered every question with the practiced patience of someone who had answered them 22 times before. When he came to the archive room afterward, he asked to see my records. I showed him the clean index, the cross-referenced logs, the dormancy chart. He studied the chart. "You've identified cluster patterns," he said. "They were in the data, the stable stretches, 41 days, 3 occurrences in 2 years. The intervals between clusters are lengthening. The medical literature suggests that Velsarin's dormancy syndrome can stabilize with age in a percentage of cases. The data here is consistent with early stabilization." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he closed his review packet. "The Bureau's assessment is that Princess Velkos remains functionally unsuitable for the marriage registry," he said. "The condition is chronic. The stabilization data is insufficient for reclassification. I'll file the updated status when I return." The data shows improvement. The data shows 3 episodes in a narrow window. That is not a trend. It is a statistical artifact. With respect, assessor, you would need to stay longer than 1 afternoon to distinguish between the two. He looked at me again. Something in his expression tightened. You are a records keeper, Mr. Gale, not a medical specialist, not a registry advocate. Your role is to catalogue and transcribe. I would suggest you remain within it. He left the next morning. 2 days later, Neath entered a dormancy cycle. It lasted 3 days. When she woke, I was in the archive room. It was early morning. The light through the east window was thin and grey. She appeared in the doorway, still wearing the soft house robe they dressed her in during dormancy, her dark auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her warm grey eyes not yet fully focused. How long? She asked. 3 days. She leaned against the door frame. The assessor? Gone. Filed his report. Functionally unsuitable? I hesitated. Yes. She closed her eyes, not in pain. In the particular resignation of someone who has heard the same verdict so many times that it no longer cuts. It just settles. One more layer on a weight she has been carrying since she was old enough to understand what her body does to her. Neath. She opened her eyes. The chart shows stabilization. The clusters are lengthening. The dormancy intervals are shortening. The data is there. The data doesn't matter, Torrin. It never has. They decided what I was before they measured anything. She looked at the chart on the wall. Her chart, the one I had built from her hours. You are the only person who has ever counted the time I was present instead of the time I was gone. She went back to her chamber. I sat at my desk for a long time. The chart on the wall showed what it showed. The bureau stamp said what it said. And somewhere between the two, a woman was being erased in increments, not by malice, but by the particular cruelty of systems that measure people by what they lack. The Velsoth T appeared again the next morning, and beside it, a small folded note in her handwriting. It said, "Thank you for counting." I kept it. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, which was not where records keepers put things they intend to file. The seasons changed on Sarin Peak in shades of grey and green. The mountain air grew colder, then warmer, then colder again. Snow dusted the courtyard slate in the mornings and melted by midday. I learned which stones she stepped on when she walked the courtyard, the same path each time, worn smooth by generations of Velkos feet, and now by hers alone. I learned that she picked the alpine sorrel, not because she liked the flowers, but because her mother had kept them in the house library in the lowland seat before the collapse, and they were the one thing that grew on the mountain that she remembered from before. My 6-month contract came and went. I filed a renewal request with the Bureau. They approved it without comment. No one else wanted the posting. Neath's cycles continued. I logged everyone. The pattern held. The stable stretches were growing. 38 days, 42, 45. I updated the chart. I filed supplementary reports with the Bureau, each one noting the trend, each one returned with the same stamp, insufficient for reclassification. During her waking hours, we talked. During her silent hours, I worked. I repaired the archive shelving. I rebound 3 volumes of the house genealogy that had been deteriorating. I cleared the drainage channel in the south courtyard so the rainwater wouldn't pool on the slate where she liked to sit. She noticed. She always noticed. She would come back from a dormancy and walk through the estate and find the small things I had done, and she would say nothing, but her eyes would rest on the repaired shelf or the cleared drain for a moment longer than necessary, and that was enough. It happened once while we were talking. We were in the archive room. She had been awake for 3 days, a good stretch, and she was helping me transcribe a damaged section of the house genealogy. She was reading aloud from the crumbling original, her voice steady and clear, and I was writing. She reached the end of a passage about a Velkos trade envoy to the Southern Basin courts, paused to check a faded glyph, and then she was gone. No warning, no gasp. One moment her voice was in the room, and the next it was not. I looked up, and she was slumped in the chair, her head tilted to one side, her breathing already slowing to that shallow, imperceptible rhythm I had come to know from the medical monitor. The book was still open in her hands. I stood. I eased the book from her fingers. I adjusted the chair so her neck was not bent at an uncomfortable angle. I found a blanket from the corridor closet and laid it across her shoulders, careful not to shift her weight. Then I sat back down at my desk and continued the transcription from where she had stopped, working from the damaged original myself, guessing at the faded glyphs as best I could. She woke 9 hours later. She blinked, looked at the blanket, looked at the original book set carefully on the table beside her, and looked at me, still at my desk, still working. "You finished the passage," she said, reading my transcription. "I may have guessed wrong on 2 of the glyphs." She studied the page. "You got them right." She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and stayed in the chair, and we continued the transcription together as though nothing had interrupted, and in a way, nothing had. The work was there, I was there. The only thing that had changed was the light through the window. One evening in the courtyard, she told me about the 22 suitors. The first 3 were formal, she said, house-arranged, proper introductions, diplomatic dinners. They were polite. They watched me fall asleep at the table, and they were polite about it. They left polite refusal letters. She paused. The middle ones were less polite. One told my house steward I was decorative but impractical. Another asked if the condition could be surgically corrected. The last few didn't even visit. They read the medical file and declined by courier. She looked at me. None of them asked about the waking hours. Not one. They all wanted to know how long I would be gone, how often, how inconvenient, as if I were a piece of equipment with an intermittent fault. She pulled her knees up slightly and rested her chin on them. And in that moment she looked younger than her years and older than her species, and I understood that this was what 11 years of being assessed had done to her. It had taught her to hold herself small so the verdict would hurt less. "You're not equipment. No." Her voice was quiet. "But I have been assessed like one for 11 years. I wanted to say something. Something that would mean what I meant. But I was a records keeper, not a poet, and the words I had were plain and workmanlike, so I said the only true thing I could find. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at me, and in the late evening light, her warm gray eyes were wet but steady, and she did not look away, and neither did I. The formal removal notice arrived 9 months into my posting. It came by diplomatic courier, a sealed bureau packet addressed to the house steward with a secondary notice addressed to me. The packet informed House Velkos that Princess Neath Velkos was being permanently removed from the Accord marriage registry on grounds of chronic unsuitability. The secondary notice informed me that my cataloging assignment was being terminated, effective upon the arrival of a transfer delegation. The delegation would arrive in 4 days. Olin brought me the notice. He stood in the archived doorway and watched me read it, and, when I looked up, his expressions was the one I had learned to recognize in him. Not hostility, not exhaustion, but something closer to grief held at arm's length. "She's in dormancy," he said. "Entered a cycle this morning, 6 hours ago." I put the notice on my desk. I looked at the chart on the wall. Her chart, every waking hour accounted for, every silent hour logged. "I'm not filing this," I said. "Mr. Gale, The data supports reclassification. The stable stretches have exceeded 45 days. The intervals between clusters have lengthened by a factor of 3 since I arrived. She is stabilizing. The Bureau knows this because I have sent them supplementary reports every quarter, and they have returned every one of them stamped insufficient. This is not an assessment. It's an erasure. Olin was quiet. Then he said, "The delegation will arrive whether you file it or not. Then they'll arrive, and I will be here, and the chart will be on the wall, and the data will say what it says." He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded once and left. The delegation arrived on the 4th day as promised. 3 Bureau officials and a House reassignment coordinator. They came up the mountain in a shuttle that looked expensive and landed on the gravel circle with the kind of precision that suggested they did not intend to stay long. Nayath was still in dormancy, 3.5 days. Her monitor hummed. Her breathing was slow and even. The alpine laurels she had placed on the courtyard wall before the cycle began was wilting in the cold air. The lead official was a woman named Assessor Kareth Fess. She was formal, composed, and she carried the removal documentation in a case that locked with a biometric seal. She sat in the archive room and spread the documents on my desk and asked me to confirm the cycle records. I confirmed them, every cycle, every duration, every waking hour. She reviewed the chart. "Stable stretching," she said, 45 days, 47 most recently, before this current cycle, and your supplementary reports to the Bureau, returned stamped, insufficient. Everyone. She studied the chart the way the Wat Dren Velorith had, with the focused attention of someone who sees something they did not expect and is deciding how much it matters. "Mr. Gale, the removal is authorized at the Bureau level. My role is to execute the documentation and arrange the Princess' transfer to a non-registry residential holding. This is not a review. It is a closure. I understand what it is. Then you understand that your cataloging assignment ends today. I do, and you intend to remain." I looked at the chart. I looked at the wilting sorrel on the courtyard wall through the window. I looked at the neat index I had built, the bound genealogy volumes, the dormancy logs filed and cross-referenced and annotated with notes that no Bureau assessor would ever read. "I intend to remain," I said. She held my gaze. I held hers. She was not unkind. I could see that. She was thorough, and she had been given a task, and she was executing it with the professionalism the Bureau required. But behind the professionalism, there was something else, a flicker of uncertainty, the kind that comes when the file says one thing and the room says another. She set the documents aside. "We will wait until the princess wakes," she said. "Protocol requires her acknowledgement of the transfer." They waited. The delegation settled into the guest quarters. Olin prepared. The Bureau officials reviewed their own files. Assessor Kareth V's came to the archive room twice more to look at the chart. I maintained the archive during those days the way I always did during dormancy. I filed the quarterly sensor logs. I updated the index with the latest cycle data. I watered the alpine sorrel on the courtyard wall, though it was already wilting in the cold air that came down from the peak at night. I did the things I had always done during the silent hours, the work that nobody had asked me to do, and that no Bureau assessment would ever credit, the small acts of maintenance that said, in the only language I had, that this place mattered, and the person who lived in it was worth the effort. Olin watched me from the corridor one afternoon. He had been with the Velkos household for 30 years. Through the political collapse, through the move to the Highland estate, through all 22 suitors and all 7 records keepers. He had earned the right to say what he said next. "You know they will take her regardless." Maybe. The Bureau does not reverse removals based on the objections of a cataloging clerk. I'm not objecting as a cataloging clerk. He studied me. Then he said very quietly, "No, I suppose you are not." The second time Carithves came to look at the chart, she asked me a question. "You have been here 9 months." "Yes." "The previous 7 records keepers averaged 12 days." "Yes." "Why did you stay?" I thought about the question. I thought about the Velsoth tea on my desk, the folded cloth to protect the wood, the alpine sorrel in the small vase, the note in my jacket pocket. I thought about her warm grey eyes in the late evening courtyard light. "Because the hours she's here matter," I said, "and someone should be present for them." She looked at me for a moment, then left without responding. Neath woke on the 5th day. I was in the archive room. It was early. The light was coming through the east window, pale gold on the stone walls. I heard her door open, heard her footsteps, unsteady at first, then evening out as her body remembered itself. She came down the corridor. She stopped in the archive doorway. She was wearing the house robe. Her dark auburn hair was loose. Her warm grey eyes found me, and then found the delegation's shuttle visible through the courtyard window, and then found the Bureau documents still spread on my desk. "How long?" she asked. 5 days, the delegation. Bureau removal. They're here to execute the transfer." She stood there. I watched the information settle into her the way it always did, not as a blow, but as weight, another layer. Her eyes went to the chart on the wall. She traced the clusters, the stable stretches. 47 days. "You stayed?" she said. "Yes, through all of it. Every hour." She looked at me, and her eyes were wet. Not tears, not yet, but the brightness of held-back water, the composure she had maintained for 11 years, bending under something it had not been built to hold. She did not look away. She stood in that doorway and held my gaze. And in the stillness between us there was something that did not need a formal registry or a bureau assessment to be real. Assessor Carithves arrived in the archive room 10 minutes later with her documentation case. The other 2 officials stood behind her. Olin was at the far end of the corridor reaching. "Princess Velkos," Carithves said, "the Bureau of Hereditary Records has authorized your permanent removal from the Accord Marriage Registry on grounds of chronic unsuitability. I am here to obtain your acknowledgement and arrange your transfer to a non-registry residential holding. Do you understand the terms?" Neath stood straight. The morning light from the east window caught the pale lavender of her skin and turned it almost silver. Her warm grey eyes were clear. "I understand the terms," she said. "Do you acknowledge the removal?" Neath looked at the chart on the wall. She looked at the index I had built. She looked at the bound genealogy volumes, the clean shelves, the filed logs. She looked at the small cass of alpine sorrel, wilted now 5 days old, that she had placed on the courtyard wall before the cycle that should have been her last one in this house. Then she looked at me. "I acknowledge," she said, "that 22 suitors reviewed my condition and left. I acknowledge that 7 records keepers were assigned to this estate, and each one departed in less than 2 weeks. I acknowledge that the Bureau has assessed me 4 times and returned the same verdict every time, and that not one assessor stayed long enough to see the pattern in the data." She turned to Carithves, "And I acknowledge that one human stayed through every silent hour, through every cycle. He did not count how long I was gone. He counted how long I was here." Her voice was steady. "His name is Torrin Gale, and he is the only person in 11 years who has treated my presence as something worth recording." The room was silent. Carithves stood with the documentation case in her hands. The 2 officials behind her did not move. Olin, at the end of the corridor, had gone still. Neath's eyes were wet and clear, and she did not wipe them. "I will not transfer," she said, "and I will not acknowledge a removal authorized by people who never stayed long enough to read the chart." The silence held. I stood up from my desk. I did not reach for her. I did not make a speech. I stood where I had been standing for 9 months, in the archive room, beside the chart, within arm's reach of the work I had done. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and the recognition between us was not a declaration or a ceremony or a document with a biometric seal. It was the simplest thing in the world. It was presence. It was the accumulated weight of every silent hour I had not left, and every waking hour she had found me still there. Carathves looked at the chart on the wall for a long time. She looked at Neath. She looked at me. Then she closed the documentation case. "I will file a supplementary review with the Bureau," she said, "based on the stabilization data documented by Mr. Gale. The removal will be suspended pending reclassification assessment." She left the archive room. The 2 officials followed. Olin, at the end of the corridor, exhaled. Neath stood in the doorway. The morning light moved across the stone floor between us. "You stayed," she said again, quieter this time. Not a question, not disbelief. A fact, the only one that had ever mattered to her, spoken into the room where I had counted her hours. "Every one," I said. She stepped into the archive room. She did not touch me. She stood beside the chart, her chart, and she placed her hand flat against the wall next to the cluster pattern that showed 47 days of waking, 47 days of being present, 47 days of being whole. "Then stay," she said. The mountain air came through the open window, cold, thin, carrying the scent of iron and alpine sorrel. The courtyard slate caught the early light and held it the way it always did, patiently, without complaint, as if the stone had been waiting too. I looked at her hand against the wall. I looked at the chart it rested beside, a year of her life measured not in deficits but in days, not in what the dormancy had taken, but in what the waking hours had given. Every data point a small proof that she was here, that she had been here, that the hours she carried were real and worth recording. She had asked me to stay, not as a records keeper, not as a bureau assignment, as the person who had been in the room during every silent hour and had never once treated her absence as a reason to leave. The archive room was quiet. The delegation's shuttle was visible through the courtyard window, but its engines were cold. Olin stood at the far end of the corridor with his hands at his sides and his 30 years of service in his posture, and he did not interrupt. I stayed,